Awesome. Well, we've got a lot to cover, so I think we have got a good contingency to dive in. So we will get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today on our webinar to discuss planning a win and fly-in. For those who are not familiar with Quorum, just give a quick overview. So Quorum is public affairs software that helps you work smarter and move faster. With Quorum, you can manage your stakeholder engagement, grassroots advocacy, legislative tracking, communications, and PAC management all in one place. We are best in class because of feedback from customers and prospects like you all. So if you have any questions about Quorum or the product, we can hold those till the end, and happy to share some of the details of how we can help you with your fly-ins, but we're going to be focusing a lot on strategy today. So our agenda, we're going to focus on kind of 6 different components of the fly-in: selecting your priority issues, recruiting your attendees, scheduling those meetings, prepping your advocates, actually executing the fly-in, and then the follow-up that comes along with that. So we've got a lot to cover here. And we have an awesome expert. So my name is Teresa. I'm the Director of Communications at Quorum, but I'm really thrilled to be joined by Kelly, the Senior Director of Communications and Advocacy at the YMCA of the USA. Kelly was so kind to join us, even though the Y literally had their advocacy days this week. And so that we could get her time for an hour is really great. And I'm sure has some new tips maybe now the Capitol is fully open, and you can see how things have changed this year from her experiences. So really lucky to have Kelly here. Thank you. We also have another guest that you'll see here, Joe Watkins. Joe is from an organization called Sketch Effect, where they attend presentations and team meetings and will create these really cool infographics. So pretty shortly, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to show Joe as he illustrates kind of the visuals of the different things that we're going to be talking about here. So you'll all get to see Joe, and then we'll get to see his end result throughout the webinar, and then also in that recording, in that email after the fact. We will be sending out a recording of this webinar, including Joe's sketch, on Tuesday of this week after the long weekend. So if you have to jump early, if you want to share details with your colleagues, look out for that in your email at the beginning of next week. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to put Joe in the spotlight, and we will jump in. So Joe, you are on. So Kelly, our first topic of the day is selecting our priority issues. Now, we've done a survey recently of the number of issues that teams tend to track in our State of Government Affairs survey, a report that we're putting out in the next couple of months. And we found that the average team is tracking like in the ballpark of 10 issues, if not more. But you can't discuss 10 issues in a fly-in. You'll never like get your message through. So 2 to 3 is really where we see a lot of folks doing sweet spots. Can you tell us a little bit about how the YMCA picks its issues that it focused on for these advocacy days this year?
Absolutely. So just like you said, we have a really long list of legislative priorities. In fact, I think it's about 4 pages long. And we know that we can't go in there with a 4-page document and expect to cover everything. And several years ago, what we did was we just told our advocates to pick the ones that were most important to them. But then we figured, you know what, legislators aren't hearing the same message from everyone. So we've evolved, and over the past several years, we've selected 3 priority issues for National Advocacy Days. And the way that we select those issues is really, what are those issues that affect the most number of Ys and our community? So for example, what doesn't change from year to year is that youth development priorities almost always revolve around funding for after school, out of school time programs. Our healthy living priorities focus around getting more money for CDC chronic disease prevention programs. And then we usually have a third priority, which is around maybe a larger initiative that we're focusing on that particular year, or maybe something that's up and coming. So for example, this year, our overall theme was around bridge building, and the Y really being a place where people of all diverse backgrounds can convene, talk about different solutions and needs in their community. So that last priority was really around legislation that focuses on civic engagement and civics education.
Awesome. So yeah, a couple of big things there is like, what is the issue that impacts the most people, so that you really have that unifying theme, or impacts the most districts. Even if your population is maybe skewed in a certain area, but you're meeting with legislators from across the country, what is kind of the most diverse? But then there's that up and coming issue, something that's new that maybe educators either aren't as aware of or educated in the ins and outs, or an issue like civic education, they might not be as aware of the WISE perspective if it's something that's newer to your portfolio. We also, along with some of the things that Kelly discussed, we see other organizations using criteria like, what are the issues that have the most misconceptions and people don't understand how they work, and so we need to fix it. What is timely with current events that's getting a lot of traction? So these are some of the different criteria that people can use to decide what issues they're going to focus their priorities on. So that issue area is really the first, but the next big thing is one of the biggest success criteria of a fly-in. It's actually having those advocates who want to show up. So when we're recruiting advocate attendees, there's a few different phases of that process that we think about in the advocate recruitment stage. We talked about 6 months out, maybe 4 or 5 months, depending on how many times your team is doing fly-ins or Hill days throughout the year. That 4 to 6 month window is when you start your recruiting of advocate attendees. And that best practice that we see is about segmenting your outreach. So using some different messages to different advocates to talk about why that they might benefit from attending a fly-in or a Hill day. So some of those segments that we see folks using, advocates who attended before, if they've been your fly-in in the past, they are going to be prime number one, easiest to convince to attend again. Then brand new advocates who might have a leadership role in your organization, a state affiliate, an executive leadership role. You might have a different message for kind of your general population advocates. And then your advocates who are in your priority districts, your priority legislators that you know that you have to meet with. Kelly, wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how the Y goes about recruitment for your advocacy days and some of the different audiences that you're working with.
Absolutely. So as I mentioned earlier, we have alliances in every state. So we let our alliances choose who's going to attend National Advocacy Days. And they're typically YMCA CEOs, board members, policy volunteers, program staff, and alliance staff. We also have a youth advocate program as part of our larger National Advocacy Days. This year we had 70 youth representing, I believe it was 47 or 48 states. So that's a really important part of our program. So primarily, it's people who have advocacy as part of their job description. We don't have members of YMCAs participate in our National Advocacy Days. Maybe on a very rare occasion, we'll have someone come who has a particularly compelling story, but really it's Y staff and volunteers. One thing we've been really focused on over the past few years is trying to engage advocates who don't have advocacy in their job description. So we've really been promoting it as a professional development opportunity for younger and newer staff. We work with our DEI team and our employee resource groups to help recruit participants as well. So really to help people understand the role that advocacy plays in the work that they do every day and how they are an advocate, whether they think of themselves or not. So we do try to invite those types of folks to advocacy days as well, knowing that we can't throw it open to the entire universe of all YMCA volunteers and staff because there are thousands of them. But so we do sort of segment it rather than opening it up to sort of the general population.
And can you talk a little bit about you talked a little about some of the scale of how many youth advocates you've had at some of your past events and this event? What is kind of your, not necessarily a specific conversion rate, but like, what's kind of the ballpark of the people that you need to reach out to in order to get that target number of attendees?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. So I think our alliances are really good at recruiting folks who both have experience and who are new. We try to target, again, we have YMCA's in almost every congressional district, but again, we couldn't accommodate that. So, I think it's hard to really have a conversion rate and to answer that question really specifically, but I will say that, our target is usually to have about 300 advocates every year. This year we reached almost 400. So I think we're doing okay in that respect.
And something we talked about in some of our previous conversations being, if you do end up in that kind of situation where you have a key legislator who's not represented by your initial wave of signups, to look to people who might have especially personal relationships to the issue that you can do more one-to-one outreach to, or to teach them that they're in a key district and talk about, like, this is the influence that your legislator has on this issue and why, like, it's especially worthwhile for you to attend. So something like after that first wave, going for those more targeted outreach.
And that's one area where Quorum has actually really helped us, because we're able to go into the Quorum database. We ask people to log relationships with policymakers. So we can go in and see, is there a Y in that district? Is there a personal contact there, whether it's a board member or a CEO? We're also really fortunate because public officials are often members of local Ys. So often folks will let us know that as well. So we're able to reach out to people based on information that they have entered into Quorum for us.
Awesome. And so obviously, if you don't have advocates attending, you're in a pretty sticky situation. But then the next really big hurdle of criteria to success is actually making sure that all those advocates coming to DC or coming to whatever state capital you're in, that they have someone to meet with. And so let's talk a little bit about some of those outreach strategies to connect advocates with officials. Now, in a typical year, Kelly, we talked about that 2 to 3 months is maybe a starting point, because if you do it too far in advance, those schedulers, those legislators, they're going to get busy. Things are going to shuffle and change. We know how staff turnover happens on the Hill. Maybe you have to change who your contact is if you're going too far in advance. Let's talk a little bit first about how you do that how you help your advocates schedule those meetings, and what that looks like.
Yeah, we actually ask our advocates to start scheduling probably around 4 to 5 weeks. And that's based on information that we got from Congressional Management Foundation, who had done some research with Hill staffers. And I actually think they said it was 3 to 4 weeks was the best time to start reaching out. So we don't reach out too far in advance. But we found that that's kind of like the sweet spot. And we provide them with template email. We provide them with talking points if they want to call. Most congressional offices have a form that they want you to use to schedule. So we provide our alliances because they usually take responsibility for coordinating the scheduling. Often the alliance leaders will schedule Senate meetings and then ask local Ys to schedule meetings with their congressional members. We provide them with a list of schedulers, and we pull that through Quorum, and they schedule their own meetings. And we find that this is most effective, again, because many of them already have existing relationships with either members or staff. And if they don't, it helps them to start building those relationships. And just generally because we think that a request from a constituent is much more effective than coming from someone on our staff. And we know that there are lots of companies out there that will do this for organizations, and they do great work. They have really good relationships with scheduling. To be honest, we can't afford that. But this way of having our alliances and YMCAs schedule their own meetings has worked really well. Now, I will say that this past summer, we had a fly-in just with youth. So we had about 200 youth come into town, and we didn't want to put scheduling meetings on them. So we worked with someone on our team, and were able to create a sheet in Quorum that helped us match the students with their public officials, and also include their scheduler's contact. So the person on our team who was working on that was able to track all of the meetings, the status of them, easily contact the offices, and that worked really well too.
I'm wondering if you can speak to what it was like this year scheduling with some brand new offices. Obviously, with turnover in an election year, there's brand new staffs, brand new members. What did that were there any things that you had to adjust this year with those kind of couple dozen new legislators?
Yeah, I wouldn't say there was, anything we really had to adjust. I do think maybe some of our folks had to reach out a little bit more frequently just to get in touch because they didn't necessarily have those relationships built up yet. So, again, we tell them use this as your opportunity to build relationships, to find the right person. So that I think that was the primary difference.
Yeah, I think obviously we were talking earlier about the advocate message, but I think that's such a compelling, like, this is your chance to really kickstart your relationship in a really positive and in-depth way. Makes a lot of sense. The other thing that I wanted to highlight that you mentioned was how you had kind of especially senior folks in those state affiliate leadership roles taking on the Senate, and then kind of a level down of leadership taking on the House meetings, and kind of dividing up, because we know there's fewer senators, there's bigger requests of their time. Someone who has maybe even a closer relationship to policy, taking that relationship and then dispersing the House meetings a little bit more. For some of our organizations on the call who aren't in that affiliate model, but still have those different levels of advocates, kind of your super advocates taking on the bigger ask of the Senate meeting, and your smaller or up and coming advocates taking on those House meeting scheduling.
And also you want someone who is coordinating all of the meetings, right? Because since we're having folks schedule their own meetings, we don't want it to be just a free-for-all. We don't want 5 different people calling the same congressional office for a meeting, right? We want one person doing that. So we definitely want to make sure we have, one person from a state, might not be scheduling all the meetings, but who is making sure that everything is coordinated so that we can be most effective.
That works great. And I'm wondering, what do those messages look like to legislators? How much are you diving into the actual asks and data, or is it just like a quick curt, we will be in DC, we are looking for a meeting, here's who will be there? What is that how much convincing do you have to do?
Yeah, not a whole lot. I think the message for the initial outreach is pretty short and sweet. We'll be in DC for our National Advocacy Days. Here are the 3 issues that we want to come talk about. And, we just give them 3 high-level bullets. They don't get into any, super detail. And yes, who's going to be here? So, because they always want to know who are the constituents that are going to be in the meeting. We have a team here in DC that goes and visits congressional members all the time, but this is for the constituents. And we know that we want the members to know that that's who will be in the meeting.
And I remember when I worked on Capitol Hill and answering phones, the very first thing you ask is, what is your address? What town do you live in? And I am going to put you at the bottom of the list if that's not something that's in our district. So I'm sure with these kinds of requests, that becomes even more important to make it super clear, I'm someone who lives in your district and I have a connection to you in your office. Okay, so now we've talked about getting your advocates there, getting your meetings on the books, but not all of our advocates are super well versed in the issues. They might need some help being prepared for an event like this. So thinking about how to prepare advocates in the weeks leading up to the event so they can make the most of that opportunity. And some of that training that different organizations share with advocates can range from as simple as how does Congress work to as advanced as in-depth training on complex policy issues. And all of those kinds of things. So Kelly, wondering if you can talk us through kind of after someone signs up, but before the fly-in happens, what kinds of communications are they receiving from you?
Absolutely. So we know that waiting until advocates get to Washington is way too late to start preparing them for their meetings. So we start with a series of webinars about 3 weeks prior to Advocacy Days. And the first is Advocacy Days 101. And that really helps people who are new understand what to expect from their time here and why Hill Days are even important. So we tell them, it's about building and maintaining relationships. It's an opportunity to highlight our legislative priorities. It puts a face and a story to our issues. Again, just helping them understand why we even do this. We share how to tell a compelling story. And that could be an entire webinar all on its own. But the key things that we tell them really are, think Jack and Jill, not War and Peace. Be clear and concise with your message. Don't use jargon. Pair the people and the stories with your statistics. Statistics are really important. Make sure you have data to back up your stories. But give things, use humanizing language so that people will remember. And then talk about the what and the why. So it's not just, I think an example we used is cancer survivorship programs are important. Okay, so what? Cancer survivorship programs are important because now more than ever, the number of Americans who are cancer survivors is projected to grow in the next 10 years. So really don't just say, this is important, but you need to tell them why, especially why it's important in their state or their district. We let them know what to expect in their meetings. We highlight the important role of staffers. Some folks place really high value on meetings with their members, and they should place high value on member meetings. But honestly, the majority of meetings are going to be with staffers. So we just remind folks that, don't dismiss staffer meetings. Those can be really important. Staffers play a really huge role in helping their bosses determine their policy priorities. And we also do 2 pre-conference webinars that are more issue specific. So one on our legislative priorities, which helps participants better understand the issues that they'll be talking about when they go up to the Hill. We provide them with talking points and how to tell their stories again, and how to frame the issues. And we also tell them what state and local data they should bring with them to make their case. So in addition to that, we prepare materials for them. We prepare talking points on the 3 priority issues. We provide background materials that go in a leave behind folder. We prepare leave behind folders for all of our advocates to take with them and leave behind with the staffer or the member at their meetings. So, there's a whole range of things that we do, but again, it's really, our goal is to prepare people for their Hill meetings prior to the time that they get to Washington, D.C.
I really like that point about preparing people that they might be with a staffer and that's still perfectly okay and productive and that their time is well spent. I was speaking with a team member at Quorum who used to manage fly-ins at her association. And the other thing that they often prompted people in advance was, Hill offices are small, like physically small. Sometimes you might be in a hallway taking your meeting. Like it's not going to necessarily be in this fancy office. If you get a chance to meet with the member, then it will maybe. But if you're with a staffer, it might be a little bit different than what you expect in that stance. And again, it doesn't mean that your meeting isn't well appreciated. The other educational strategy that I've seen some organizations use is people get inundated with questions in the lead up, and the staff at this organization didn't have the capacity to respond to every single advocate's emails of all the questions they had for attending. And so they actually created like state captains of people who had been to the event before, who could be the person to be that first line of response in answering questions, giving advice for someone who's attending their first fly-in. So that was just a different strategy I saw an association use that worked pretty well. The other thing that I just want to call out that Kelly mentioned to reinforce is that there is some responsibility on you as the advocate to bring those materials that are needed to be successful with the state and local data, that you can't just show up and walk in with no preparation, that there is some of that, that the folks on the ground in different localities will be best equipped to provide.
Teresa, I'll add one more thing is before going into the meeting, especially if there are multiple people going in, know who is doing what. So you need to be flexible, right? Like that's the number one rule, but also have some sort of structure. So know who's going to introduce everyone who's in the meeting, know who's going to talk about what issue, know who's going to ask at the end for a photo and, designate that person to take that photo and tweet it out with a thank you afterwards. So just kind of have all of that in advance so that when you go in, people aren't talking over one another, because your time could be short. You could have a 15-minute meeting, especially if it's with a member. So just to put that structure in place.
Talking over one another or having some kind of an awkward silence when you're in the presence of a legislator that can be sort of intimidating if you've never done that before. So now that kind of leads in well to our next section, which is the actual day of the fly-in, the days or multiple days, howbeit. That's like where the big production is happening. Kelly, you talked a little bit about the different roles that take place in a meeting. Wondering, you can talk through what the day of looks like for you and some of the things people might need to be prepared for, whether that's rescheduling or those things that could go wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And you just said it, like, I can tell you just from these past couple of days, we we have a whole conference around our Hill Days. So we start off and we have an afternoon of educational time and afternoon and then a morning, and then folks go up to the Hill. And meeting times change all the time. So we tell people, make sure you're keeping track of your email, make sure nothing has changed. Some people might have a meeting scheduled with the member, and then it ends up being with a staffer, or it might be that they're saying, oh, hey, I know you had a meeting with this staffer, but if you come at this time, you might actually be able to meet with Senator, whatever, so, it's both good and bad, but just to make sure that they're keeping an eye on things, because things can really change. We remind them to wear comfortable shoes because they could be going back and forth across the Hill multiple times. Make sure that they eat breakfast and they eat lunch and they carry water with them, just all of those little things throughout the day. We make sure they know, where the cafeterias are. We have people stationed at different places. We used to have a resource room on the Hill, so we would work with a staff office just to get like a small conference room where we would have staff sitting. We would bring extra materials in case people needed them. They could come and ask questions. If they got lost or needed to know how to get from one place to the next, we could help them with that. That didn't work out this year, but we had staff stationed in Longworth cafeteria and Dirksen cafeteria. And we had folks come up to us and ask questions, or even if they just wanted to take a break. So those are some of the things that we do for the day of.
Awesome. And this question I was going to save till the end, but kind of fitting. Can you talk a little bit about what you experienced this year with the kind of return to in-person? Were there any offices that were still hesitant and still not willing to take that step? Were there any rules that you still had to follow? What did that kind of look like?
Yeah, so I will say that it was kind of business as usual. Getting through security was really easy. And I will also say it's February, which I think is kind of a lighter month. At least this week was a lighter week because the House was not in session. As folks who plan these events know, I'm sure many people who are listening, you have to book your hotel well in advance. So we booked our hotel 2 years ago. We don't know what the congressional calendar is going to look like. So we go by past years' calendars. And typically the year before the week before President's Day is not a recess week. This year, the House chose to take recess this week. So maybe a lot of people chose not to schedule their Hill Days, but there were other organizations on the Hill this week besides us. But okay, now I'm losing my train of thought, sorry. So what was I talking about?
Anything that stayed virtual?
Yes, that's right, yes. So we did have several meetings that were virtual, and we told our advocates to call back just to see if those offices realized that they were actually here in DC or if they were just requesting more general meetings. And they said, yep, no, we're still not taking meetings. And in some cases, it might be because there's someone who's immune compromised in that office. So there could be a variety of reasons for that. But we did have some advocates who had at least a meeting that was virtual. But for the most part, everything was wide open
Yeah, at that point of calling back and seeing like that's something I wouldn't have thought of before. To see if they were like, you're
Just
really
in
sure?
case.
Just in case.
And the other thing that we told people was, well, you know, if they don't want to do an in-person meeting here in DC, and I was going to talk about this a little bit later, but invite them to the Y, invite them back home. And maybe that's, you know, again, another opportunity that you have.
Awesome. And then this as kind of a strategy that kind of bleeds between the day of and in the follow-up. Can you tell us a little bit about the advocate surveys and the meeting notes that you have folks fill out based on what they learn and discuss in those meetings?
Absolutely. So yeah, we do create a form through Quorum. So then it actually goes into our database and it's linked up with all the relationships. So it works out really well. And yeah, we ask them to log all of their meetings. What issues did they talk about? Which staffer did they meet with? What was the discussion? You know, what were their, what did the staffer tell them about the issues? Would they support it or ask? Would they not support it and why? And is there any follow-up that our team back in Washington needs to do, or, you know, do they want to get the information and follow up with them on their own? Because we do really try to reach back out if there's any follow-up that's needed. It's also really good information for us to have in our year-round advocacy. So when our team, our advocacy team, is going up to the Hill to talk to members of Congress or staff, it's good for us to know what conversations the advocates had in those meetings so that we can reference back to them.
And I know something that another organization I've worked with discussed in that follow-up is trying to pinpoint, like, if they gave pushback on an issue, like, did they give any details about what pushback it was? So if it was a budget issue, basically finding, like, is there a way in? Is there something, if they're against the issue or like aren't agreeing to the whatever that ask is, like, is there a component of it that they're okay with? Or based on the kind of tone of the meeting, did you get any additional like color other than that? Yes, no. With some folks experiencing that legislators might be a little more candid with one of their constituents than with someone that they perceive as this corporate voice or just the whatever it may be. And so those notes really are valuable. And so for folks who ask a question about what that looks like in Quorum, we don't have any visuals prepared right this moment, but if you want to reach back out to us, we're happy to show that. Essentially, to just kind of describe that a little bit, Quorum works on mobile. And so it looks like a survey that folks can, you can share out a link beforehand. And there's some basic information, but you can add kind of open-ended notes or your own custom fields. For example, some folks will use what was the sentiment, positive, negative, neutral, which of these three issues were discussed. So it's really a mobile-friendly link from Quorum folks can fill out that then is collected all in the database for the public affairs team or grassroots advocacy team to then digest and go through those notes. It's also saved to that legislator's profile. So if your lobbyist is going into a meeting a couple days later, they can see, oh, I see that so-and-so was in here a couple days ago. Let me make sure that I'm continuing the conversation instead of kind of repeating the conversation this other person had. So a couple of different ways of using that information.
One thing we always encourage our advocates to do is to maybe start their meetings with, hey, do you have a why story? So other organizations could do the same thing. Like, what is, whether it's a staffer or a member, what is their connection to your organization? And that's also good to put in the notes, because again, that's just helpful when in follow-up, you can refer to that, and also helps you to identify champions down the road.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm going to take the questions that kind of relate to this conversation. You talked a little bit about preparing the materials in the preparing advocates on the day of. What do those look like? Do you still use handouts for the actual officials and offices?
We do. And I will say, when I first started leading the planning and organizing of this conference, like, we had a folder that was this thick. And every year I try to cut it back and cut it back. And finally this year, I got it to the point where it was only 4 pages of information. We have our longer, maybe it's a little more than 4, but it's much thinner. We have our longer list of legislative priorities that we include. We include a 1-pager with our top 3 priorities for National Advocacy Days. And then we have a 1-page sort of issue summary about each of the 3 priorities. And that's it. That's all we take in. We used to have longer issue briefs that went through all of our legislative priorities, but I mean, what we've heard and what we found is that the more information you take with you, the less they'll read. They probably have 15 meetings a day, and they're getting a lot of information. So we've tried to really pare that down and provide them with the most relevant information for our asks.
Awesome.
And that's for the Hill leave behinds, but for our members, our advocates, we do give them more detailed information for their preparation.
And then finally, you must be in the thick of this now, having just wrapped up. What is that? Obviously, you're not done when everyone leaves DC or the state capital that they're in. What does that next step look like, both from engaging the people that attended and as well as following up on the policy issues?
Yeah, so honestly, for the next week or so, we will be sending out multiple emails encouraging people to fill out those forms reporting on their Hill meetings. And once we get as many of those as we can, and just because you ask doesn't mean they're going to fill them in, but we try to get as many as we can because we want to be able to quantify how many meetings did we have. What were the perceptions of our issues? Were they mostly positive, negative? We'd like to just get a sense of that. So we'll review those reports and we'll just pull those together. And it helps us in our year-round advocacy. And it helps us to be able to, talk about sort of the ROI, what do we need and what do we need to be focusing on? What are the messages? Maybe we need to tweak our key messages when we're talking about issues if people weren't responding to something or responding in a way that we didn't expect. So, we use that information in a variety of ways.
And then on the advocate side, how are you, I love the line that a couple of folks that we've worked with and had speak on webinars at the Y use, that advocacy is a year-round activity. How do you use this as a jumping off point for folks to do all the other things that fit under the advocacy umbrella?
Absolutely. So yeah, this is kind of like the kickoff for a year of advocacy, right? We kick things off at National Advocacy Days. Our state alliances have state advocacy days. And for us, we have almost like quarterly campaigns where we might focus on a different legislative priority every quarter, and we do action alerts to keep them engaged when maybe there's not something really big going on. We encourage Ys to invite their members or staff into their YMCAs to see how those policies that we were talking about actually are implemented on the ground. So for example, we might bring them in to come and read to some kids in a childcare program. We might have them serving food at one of our food program sites so that, again, they can see where that money is or how that money is being spent and the impact it's having right where they live. So we have just various touch points throughout the year where we're reminding them. We have an August recess campaign. Again, we remind them that you don't have to wait until August necessarily to invite your public officials in, but it's a great time because your congressional members will be home in August. Invite them to camp. We've got great photos. So we've paired it with a photo contest, and we encourage Ys to take photos and tweet them out of member visits. And it's not just their federal lawmakers. We tell them to do it with their school board members, with their mayors, their county councils, their city council members. But we have an incentive of, submit your photos, use the hashtag #YAdvocate, and we'll choose 3 winners who get free registration to our National Advocacy Days. So again, just trying to kind of maybe use their natural instinct for competitiveness against one another to encourage them to make those invites and have those visits.
That's awesome.
And this year,
go
one of the things we're doing too, is,
No.
as I mentioned, we had the conference portion of the event. And, obviously that was just for 400 people, but we don't want to keep that a secret. We think there's information about advocacy and the work that we do that's important for Y leaders across the country. So what we're doing this year is we're looking at another webinar series, which takes some of the information that we presented during the Advocacy Days conference and breaks it down to go into more detail. So we had several federal officials talking about different funding opportunities. So instead of a panel, we might bring each one of those federal agency leaders to a webinar and talk about those opportunities for collaboration separately. So lots of little different ways that we do that.
I think we've got a number of questions, so I'm going to dive into Q&A, but one that I think kind of bleeds into you talking about the wider conference around your fly-in is, how do you sell your fly-in to advocates? Obviously, coming to DC is expensive, and many organizations are not covering the costs of their attendees to get to DC and to stay here. So how do you alleviate those concerns or make it worthwhile?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, we keep our conference fees down really low. We try not to make it cost prohibitive. One of the reasons our event is in February this year is because, hotels in DC are really expensive in the spring because so many organizations do these types of events. And, let's not forget the cherry blossoms. Like everyone always says to us, how come we're here in February? Why can't we come back in March or April? And, legitimately, our response is, it's the appropriations process. We want to get in before appropriations requests are due. This is when we can make the most impact. And that is 100% true. But we also want to keep it affordable for folks. We don't want cost to be a factor for people in coming. I think we have a pretty solid base of advocates. Our YMCA CEOs and their volunteers, they know that advocacy is important. They know that, federal funding and our legislative priorities, I would say, are 80% focused around different funding streams that could, benefit Y programs. So, they know that those programs are really important to help them sustain their programs and help them serve their communities better. Again, whether it's being able to scholarship more kids into childcare and after school, or enhancing their anti-hunger initiatives. So I think they realize just the importance of coming and developing and keeping those relationships with their members of Congress. And, we always say it's important, those relationships are what are really, really important. We never want, just to be asking public officials for something. We're also wanting to make sure that they understand that we are a valued partner with them in the community. So again, that's that ongoing advocacy piece. It's not just about the ask, but it's about that relationship and making yourself a valued partner.
And so this is kind of a logistical question. In this return to Capitol Hill post-COVID, were you all able to walk freely through the halls? I know previously you had to have escorts and someone to meet you at the door.
Yep, it is 100% back to pre-COVID. You did not need, because over the summer, actually, I participated in a small fly-in back in November, and you still needed to have escorts. But as of this year, there are no escorts needed. You can roam freely.
And someone is asking about some of their DC events where they bring in C-suite or high-level executive groups. So maybe on a smaller scale than what you had this week, and how to make their time worthwhile. And so I'm wondering if you have any things that you all do with some of your CEOs or your most senior leaders when they're here, that's maybe above and beyond what your typical fly-in looks like.
Absolutely. So we have once a year National Advocacy Days, and then periodically throughout the year, and the issues will change. We do have smaller issue-specific fly-ins that might be, 10 to 15, maybe 20 people. And it will be a group of people with, so I'll give an example. We have a housing network, so YMCAs that provide both housing and other social services. What we'll do is we'll invite them to have, they might have quarterly in-person meetings. They have been virtual, obviously, over the past several years, but we'll invite them back to do their in-person meeting in our office in DC. And then we will attach a fly-in to that meeting. So that way they're not just coming in for the fly-in, but it's a value add to a meeting that they would already have. So we've done this with financial development folks. We've done it with camp leaders. We've done it around the charitable deduction. So it just depends. We've done it with chief financial officers. So folks who have, again, something in common. We pick the one issue that's important to them. They have their meeting and then they go up to the Hill.
Awesome. I don't see any other questions right now, but I guess, Kelly, one question I have for you, as anyone who does any project, when it's over, you start thinking of the things you might add or do differently next time. Is there any of those things that kind of, now that this is fresh and top of mind for you, that you thought like, this is gonna be a great thing to do next year that I might do differently or additive?
Yeah, so, and it's actually an idea that came from one of our state alliances. And I noticed it while I was kind of scrolling through Twitter yesterday, looking at all of the tweets from the meetings. Because the House was not in session, a lot of folks were disappointed that they couldn't meet with their House members. So our Florida Alliance took the opportunity to suggest, hey, you can't come to DC for advocacy days. Our members are going to be back at home. Why don't you see if you can schedule a meeting with them at home? So I thought that was a great idea. So if this were to happen again, unfortunately, which we hope it doesn't, we hope, from now on, we have both houses in session when we're there, but I think that was a really great idea. And another thing that I'll just add that's kind of not necessarily answering your question, but related, we do sort of, and now we call it a virtual advocacy days. It has a different, virtual advocacy days has a different meaning now, but prior to the pandemic, we would link an alert campaign to advocacy days. So for those folks who couldn't come to advocacy days, they could still feel like they were part of the event by reaching out to their members of Congress with a message that's similar to what advocates who are here were talking about. And honestly, like some of the things that I would change about this year are more related to things at the hotel and logistical things than more strategic things.
Yeah. No, I remember I spoke with your team members who planned that kind of, we called it a virtual fly-in at the time, but if it was before we knew what that would mean, where with Quorum, you can essentially set it up to kind of hold your messages. Yep. And then kind of release them all at the same time, so that it has that added impact that the same day a legislative office is meeting a person, they're also seeing that rise to the top of their list of issues that people emailed about that day. So really combining, like even before COVID, we're talking about how do we bring digital and in-person, because face-to-face, whether you're a lobbyist or an advocate, those face-to-face meetings tend to have more impact. But with all these new digital tools, how do we bring them in the fold? And that I thought was one of the really creative ways to kind of come at it from multiple angles and really bring together your whole network.
Yeah. What we did this year was our CEO wrote a blog post that was published on Monday, and it was basically an open letter to Congress, congratulating new members, welcoming back old ones, and really focusing on, again, our role as a convener in communities, the fact that we want to work with them to advance important social issues, and reiterating our 3 priority asks. And we turned that into a campaign where we sent it out to our advocates network of, I think it's 15 to 17,000 people now, asked them to share that with their senators and their member of Congress, and then tweet it and tag their members of Congress, this open letter to Congress from our CEO. So that was just another touch point for folks who couldn't be in Washington to elevate the message that we were sharing on the Hill this week. Because again, we want everyone to feel like they're an advocate, not just people who have advocacy in their job title or in their job descriptions.
Awesome. I don't see any more questions. And so I think we can wrap up. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us today. We will be sharing out the recording at the beginning of next week, right after the holiday weekend. And it will include Joe's drawing here. He'll make some last cleanups and edits and finalize that, which we'll be able to share with you all. And if you liked it, please let us know, and we can bring Joe back again for future webinars as well. And I want to thank Kelly again, who, again, for those who were not here at the beginning, Kelly's and the YMCA's advocacy days were this week. And so the fact that she was able to give us an hour of her time, what I'm sure is an exhausting week, is awesome. And we're really thankful. So thanks for everyone for joining, and have a great rest of your day.